He was just a guy, a regular guy. You wouldn't have looked twice at him if you passed him on the pier with a coil of rope over his shoulder and a coffee in his hand. But when I looked at him, I saw something else entirely. He walked up the gangway of our rusted-out research vessel like he belonged to the sea and the sea belonged to him. His coveralls were oil-stained, his hair was a mess from the wind, and his badge just said mate/diver, Eric. That's it. No halo. No soft focus. Just a tired guy late for night shift. To me, he was the warmest thing I'd ever felt that wasn't on fire. You know how it feels when you're underwater, 30 meters down, and you find that thermocline when the water suddenly goes from icy to almost bath warm and you just drift there, stunned? Being near him felt like that all the time. A pocket of warmth at the bottom of an endless, freezing ocean. His eyes were that ridiculous pale blue that looks clear if the light hits right, the color of a shallow sandbar over deep water. When he laughed, you felt like you were standing on a sunlit deck, no matter how cold and dark it really was. His voice could calm a panicking diver over the radio with 2 words. Everyone loved him. Everyone leaned toward him like plants toward a window. That's why I deserve what I got after I killed him. Yeah, I killed him. On a night so damp the bulkheads were sweating and the sea was flat and black as oil. I really couldn't help myself. His kind is my favorite. I don't say that lightly. You'd probably call what I'm a vampire if you needed a word for it, but it's older and wetter than that. I grew teeth when people still thought the horizon was a wall, and falling off, it meant you met gods. I feed on warmth that settles in the blood. Not just body heat, not just calories. I mean the kind of heat that comes from people who go back in the water when everyone else is scrambling out. Medics, rescuers, divers who cut themselves out of their own umbilicals to unsnag someone else's. Coast Guard crews punching through storms everyone else sails away from. Selfless people taste different. All that golden warmth they carry around, and no one ever really sees it. The world just uses them, squeezes them dry, tosses them back. They get exhausted and lonely and still drag themselves out of bed for the next call. That kind of blood doesn't fight you. It pours into you like it's been waiting for the invitation. You bite down, and it rushes in hot, thick, and bright, and for days afterward, every vein hums with that borrowed goodness. Eric was the purest I'd ever tasted, and I try not to think about that too hard while I was dating him. He didn't see it coming. They never do. In his head, I was just a new medic hired cheap because I didn't mind the water. That's why I told him in my interview. I don't mind the water. I've lived in it longer than pressure hulls have existed, but sure, let's call it not minding. Normally, I don't stick around. One night, one storm, one flooded compartment. Enough to drink, then I go. Ships sink, I move on. Men drown, I move on. Names blur together like foam. But with him I stayed. A couple months turned into a year. Then 2, then 3. We rotated off that vessel to a shoreside rescue station. Then back to another research run. Then an offshore drilling rig that smelled like diesel and old fish guts. Wherever he went, I went. He made it too easy to forget counting by centuries. He kept me entertained. He was funny in that dry, dumb way where he'd say the exact wrong thing in a crisis and make everyone laugh anyway. He had this habit of tapping the hull with his knuckles when we were at anchor, 3 slow knocks, like he was answering something. It annoyed the shit out of the night watch, but the sound echoed through the metal like a heartbeat. I should have known that would stick. I don't know why I didn't just let what we had be enough. For the first time, I almost had a life. We shared a tiny cabin on the rig when we were between runs. We argued about playlists. He left coffee rings everywhere. I pretended to hate them, but I liked the way they stained the charts like little tide marks of him. If I could live like that with him, why did I have to take more? I wasn't hungry. That's the worst part. I was happy. I think he was too. It didn't have to end the way it did. Our last night started stupidly normal. It was our anniversary, 3 years since we'd met on the deck of that first rust bucket, and we'd gotten shore leave long enough for a proper meal. He booked a table at this restaurant built into an old ferry tied permanently to the dock. The whole thing rocked gently with the swell, and smelled like fried calamari and spilled beer and brine seeping up through the bilge. The same table. If he still works there, he'd said when he made the reservation. By the starboard windows. That was where he'd taken me on our first date after a 12-hour shift pulling some idiot fisherman off a reef. I'd come in still wearing someone else's blood, hair stiff with dried salt, and he just smiled like I was the only person in the room who wasn't a disaster. That night, the bay was calm, the sky streaked orange and purple, and the water outside the windows turned dark gold. I remember watching the sunset reflected in his eyes, feeling my chest fill up to bursting with this stupid, hot, human feeling. He was laughing about something. One of our crew who'd nearly fallen in the moon pool because he'd walked backward talking with his hands. Every time he laughed, everyone around us softened. The servers, the couple at the next table, the bored bartender polishing glasses. His warmth spilled over and brushed them, too. It made me sick. I know how that sounds, but try to understand. I could feel his warmth leaving me. Just little filaments brushing over strangers and then dissolving. I could feel it so clearly, it was like watching blood drip into a drain. All that golden heat he carried so effortlessly, and they got to touch it for free. They got his smile, his attention, his easy kindness. None of them could ever appreciate what he was. Not the way I did. Not with the hunger I had for it. And the bartender smiled at him. She was cute in that generic harbor way. Hair in a messy bun, tiny anchor tattoo behind one ear, shirt damp at the sleeves where the tap had splashed her. When she leaned over the bar to set down our drinks, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and gave him this quick, bright smile. Her gaze snagged on his for half a second longer than it needed to. I felt her mind catch the trail of his warmth like a current. A little eddy, a swirl. My stomach turned. He didn't even flirt back. He just smiled politely and said, "Thanks, Lila," reading her name off the badge. He had that thing where he made everyone feel like the center of the room for as long as he was talking to them. He couldn't help it. She walked away, hugging that tiny piece of him like a hand warmer. I could taste it from where I sat. That brush of him on her. Instinct took over. Not the patient, stalking instinct I'd honed over shipwrecks and storm seasons. Something uglier. Older. Territorial. I watched her step out through the side door onto the small deck half an hour later for a cigarette. I told Eric I was going to the bathroom and slipped after her. The night air hit me like a slap. Colder, wetter than the big, cozy dining room. The ferry creaked against its moorings, and the harbor slapped quietly at the hull. You could hear chains clink and the distant thrum of an engine from some late boat pushing out through the breakwater. Lila was leaning against the rail, blowing smoke out over the water, phone in one hand, lighter in the other. Her breath steamed white in the air. She didn't hear me open the door over the rattling of plates and laughter inside. "I'm on my break," she said without looking, assuming I was her manager. "I know," I said. "I just wanted to thank you." She glanced over, smiled, polite but tired. "For what?" "For how you smiled at my boyfriend." Her smile faltered. "Sorry, I wasn't." I stepped closer. The harbor reflected in her eyes, a smear of colored lights on black. "Don't lie," I said softly. "You felt it, didn't you? That warmth. Like standing under a heat lamp after a long shift in the cold. You felt it, and you wanted more." She frowned. Cigarette pausing halfway to her lips. "I flirt with everybody. Tips are better." "It's not. You're making it weird." She tried to laugh it off. "Look, I'm just doing my job, okay? Guys give you better tips if you flirt. That's all." You know that sound when a hull starts to fail? That groan that goes through the steel like a living thing? That's what I heard inside myself. Something long and restrained flexing. "Your job," I repeated. The world narrowed until it was just her pulse under the thin skin of her throat, beating quick and bright. There was still a smear of Eric on her tongue from where she'd licked her lips after thanking him for being such a sweetheart. I moved before she could exhale. I shoved her against the metal bulkhead, one hand over her mouth, the other catching the back of her neck. She dropped the cigarette. It hissed when it hit a puddle on the deck, a faint sizzle I barely registered. She tried to knee me. I pinned her legs with mine. Her scream came out as a muffled, wet sound against my palm. "I'm just doing my job," I mocked quietly, leaning close enough that she could smell the salt on my skin, the old brine stink that never washes out. "Guys give you better tips if you flirt, right? Just a job." Her eyes went wide. She started nodding frantically, tears mixing with the sea spray on her cheeks. I could feel the tendons in her throat shift as she tried to swallow. I didn't even need to bite hard. When my teeth broke skin, her blood hit my tongue like cheap vodka and menthol and a thin, sad little smear of Eric's warmth underneath it all. A crumb. A fucking crumb. I sucked it greedily, chasing the faint aftertaste of him. She bucked and clawed at my arm. Nails tore skin. I didn't care. My jaw worked, pulling, drinking. But the more I took, the worse it got. Her flavor collapsed into cold ash. The menthol burned my sinuses. The warmth I hunted for was barely a trace, already dissolving. She made this horrible gurgling noise and sagged. I didn't feel the moment her neck snapped against the bulkhead. It was just a soft pop under my hand. I hadn't been that rough with food since I was a child, still figuring out where human bones were weakest. How fucking embarrassing. I let go. She slid down the metal and crumpled on the deck, one arm askew, fingers brushing the small scupper where water drained back to the sea. Blood spread under her like a dark halo, mixing with the puddles of rain and spray. That was when the emptiness hit. All that golden energy I'd been buzzing with all day, Eric's laugh, his touch, his stupid habit of humming to the radio when we washed gear together, was just gone. Not drained, not used. Gone like someone had opened a seacock in my chest and let it all rush out. I stared down at Lila's body, my mouth sticky with her, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no warmth, just this cold, echoing hollowness and the creeping realization that I was standing on the outside deck of a floating restaurant in a port with security cameras and drunk humans, and I was covered in blood. I grabbed her under the arms. Her head lolled grotesquely. I turned away from me so I didn't have to see her eyes. The metal deck vibrated under my feet with the thump of music inside and the distant rumbling of a tugboat moving along the quay. There was a maintenance hatch in the corner, a little grated door leading down to the bilge where they pumped out gray water. I wrenched it open with one hand, metal shrieking. The smell of stale seawater and grease puffed up, thick and sour. "Someone else's problem," I muttered and shoved her through. She hit the water below with a wet thud and a splash I hoped no one heard over the music. For a second, her arm floated in the dark, sleeve puffed. Then the bilge pump kicked on with a chug, and she was gone, dragged out into the harbor with the rest of the ship's filth. I shut the hatch, wiped my hands on my dress, and stepped back inside. The warmth hit me in the face like sunlight on steel. Eric was at the bar, laughing with one of our crewmates. He turned when he felt me, smile already forming, but it flickered when he saw my expression. "You okay?" he asked, starting to stand. I forced my lips to shape something. "I think the oysters were bad. I need to get back to the cabin. I'm going to be sick." His brow creased. Concern rolled off him in a wave I could almost see. "Do you want to come with?" God, I wanted that. I wanted to bury my head in his shoulder and let him carry me out. I wanted to tell him what I'd done, what was wrong with me, how empty I felt. No, I lied because I didn't want him to see the blood under my nails. "Stay. Enjoy the night. I'll text you." He hesitated, then nodded. "Call me if you need anything, okay?" He meant it. Of course he did. I left before I could lose my nerve. My phone buzzed in my hand as soon as I stepped onto the dock, his name on the screen, but I ignored it. The night had gotten colder. Fog was crawling in off the bay, wrapping the boats in gauze. The water slapped quietly at the pilings. A water taxi driver, smoking by his little boat, squinted at me. "You fall in or something?" he asked, eyeing the smears on my dress. "Costume party," I said. My voice sounded wrong in my own ears. Fake blood. He laughed. Hell of a party. He didn't look close enough to see that it was already drying brown. I'm glad most people can't smell blood properly. The metallic tang was so strong it made me nauseous. Underneath it all, I could still taste that menthol clinging to the back of my throat like smoke. The ride across the harbor was short. The taxi slapped over small waves, engine rattling. Lights from anchored ships smeared on the dark water like oil. I sat there shivering, clutching myself, feeling the emptiness inside yawning wider with every minute that passed away from Eric. Our home was a converted trawler tied up at the far end of the marina. A rusting hulk Eric had been slowly fixing up between contracts. The air inside always smelled like damp rope, coffee, and him. I stepped into the cramped cabin, peeled the sticky dress off, and threw it straight into the small diesel stove in the corner. The flames licked up eagerly, turning the fabric into a stinking black lump. I watched it burn like it was someone else's problem, then turned to the tiny bathroom. The shower was barely big enough to turn around in, a metal box with a drain that gurgled straight to the sea. I cranked the hot water and stepped in. Blood turned the spray pink immediately. Long red streaks ran down my arms, spiraled over my ribs, then swirled around my feet, mixing with the water before slipping through the grate. I watched it go like I'd watched bodies sink from the decks of galleons and U-boats and cruise ships. Familiar, as inevitable as tides. It felt wrong this time, like something important was being washed away that wasn't Lila. I turned the tap hotter until the steam fogged the mirror. My skin prickled. I still felt cold, somewhere under my sternum, like the deep sea had moved in and pushed everything else aside. Since when does feeding feel disgusting? I pressed my palm to my mouth and forced myself to vomit. Thick, dark stuff hit the drain. It smelled like stale smoke and cheap gin and fear, and it burned my throat coming up. I spat until I tasted nothing but water and bile. Some part of me knew it couldn't make a difference. Whatever had gone wrong wasn't about Lila's blood being bad or sick. She wasn't important enough for that. But the empty feeling was unbearable, and I needed to try something. Even after I'd rinsed every trace of her down the drain and scrubbed my skin until it was raw, the hollowness stayed. I stumbled to the narrow bed we shared in the bow, naked and still damp, and curled into a tight ball under the blanket. I pulled it over my head and just cried. It was pathetic. I'd seen humans sob before, obviously. I'd watched widows scream themselves hoarse on docks. I'd heard grown men bawl in lifeboats while the ship that carried them burned behind them. I'd always been slightly curious about it, in a detached way, the way you'd be curious about whale song. This was different. My body shook. My throat made these ugly, strangled noises I couldn't control. My eyes burned and wouldn't stop leaking. I curled tighter, clutching my own ribs like I was trying to keep my insides from spilling out through the hole in my chest. I don't know how long it went on. Time gets weird when you've got centuries under your belt. Minutes stretch, years snap by. All I know is at some point, the crying became this dry, soundless heaving, and the only thing in the world was that goddamn emptiness. Then I heard the key in the lock. The familiar click, the scrape of the hatch. The boat rocked as his weight came aboard. And with it, like someone opening an oven door, warmth flooded the little cabin. The change was so abrupt I gasped. It hurt like thawing frostbitten fingers. "Babe," he called softly. "You awake?" I pushed the blanket down from my face. My cheeks were stiff with dried tears. My hair stuck to my skin. His outline filled the doorway, backlit by the faint glow from the galley. His hair was damp from the fog, little droplets clinging to it, jackets speckled with them. His cheeks were red from the cold. His hands were freezing when he touched me. But even that cold felt like a lifeboat thrown into rough water. I grabbed him, harder than I meant to. I hauled him onto the bed, onto me, wrapping my arms around him like I was afraid he'd fall through the floor and be gone. He made a surprised little oof sound as the air was squeezed out of him. Hey, easy, he laughed weakly, patting my back. What happened? Did someone die? Are you hurt? His breath puffed against my neck. I could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, right under his ribs where my hand lay. I loosened my grip a fraction and pushed his head down onto my chest, tucking him under my chin. "No," I said, and I made my voice gentle. "I just felt sick and then I left and I missed you." I freaked myself out. He relaxed a little. His fingers traced circles along my arm. "I'm sorry you felt so awful," he murmured. "I know we were both looking forward to tonight." He tilted his head up enough to press a kiss to my clavicle, right where the pulse should have been if I were really what he thought I was. "I'll book the ferry again next week when you're better," he said. "We can get that stupid flaming dessert you like." I kissed his hair, breathing him in. Salt, soap, a ghost of fried food from the restaurant. Underneath it all, that layered warmth that soaked into everything he touched. My muscles gradually unclenched. For a moment, the emptiness receded. I could almost pretend Lila's blood hadn't been wrong, that the night was just a glitch and everything else would click back into place. He inhaled, mouth pressed to my skin, then drew back slightly. "Do you smell that?" he asked. Every nerve in my body lit up. "Smell what?" My voice came out too fast. He frowned, nose wrinkling. "Like wet pennies." He inhaled again, slower. "And menthol." Terror hit me, so hard it was physical. A drop in internal pressure. My heartbeat, when I remembered to mimic one, stuttered. I don't remember what happened next. Not fully. There's a blank spot, like a chunk of tape cut out of a recording. One moment I was lying there with him in my arms. The next I was somewhere else, my hands slick, the air thick and metallic. Panic does that to me sometimes. The thing inside me that keeps me moving through centuries can also shut things off when they hurt too much. The next clear memory I have is sitting up in the bed, the blanket tangled around my legs, the cabin too quiet. I was alone. No, not alone. He was there, just not the way he'd been. His body lay across my lap, dead weight heavy in a way living bodies never are. His eyes were open, staring up at the low ceiling like he was watching condensation drip. Blood smeared his face, dark in the dim light. It bubbled slowly from the corner of his mouth with each shallow, involuntary breath. I had my thumbs on his lids, forcing them open, desperately trying to catch his gaze. "Look at me," I whispered. "Please look at me." When his pupils finally focused on mine, I saw the realization hit. Not of what I don't think that ever fully landed, but of what had happened. His lips moved. A wet, rattling breath pushed through them, carrying a spray of red that speckled my chest. "See," he whispered. His voice was barely audible over the distant slap of water against the hull. "You soon." His eyes softened, just like they did when he'd roll over half asleep and lay his head on my chest. That same loving, stupid, human look. It twisted something in me so violently I almost dropped him. Then the light went out of his face. If this were a story meant to make you feel better, this is where I'd tell you he meant those words. That he knew he'd lodged himself in me somehow. That he'd found a way to follow his warmth down into the thing that was eating him. He didn't know. There's no way he could have. He was just saying something people say when death walks in the room. Something comforting. Something naive. None of that mattered in the moment. All I knew was that I'd done it. I'd killed the only thing in this rotten, drowned world that had ever made me feel full, and it felt wrong. When I feed, I remember every mouthful. I can tell you, centuries later, exactly how the blood of a Roman sailor dragged off his trireme by a storm tasted different from the blood of a modern engineer trapped behind a watertight door. But I couldn't remember taking Eric into my mouth. 1 second, we were in our bunk. The next, he was empty, and his golden warmth was smeared across my lips. I could still taste how pure he was. It coated my tongue, subtle and layered, like sunlight filtered through clear water. It should have made me incandescent. Instead, the emptiness roared back, bigger than before. I felt hollowed out. It was like eating the sun and being left with an ice cube in my gut. He was still here. Every part of him was still in the room. His clothes hung on the hook by the hatch. His tools were in their box. His half-finished mug of coffee sat on the little table, cold and skinned over. But he was gone, and the color had leached out of everything without him. The wooden panels, the oilcloth, the battered metal of the walls. All of it faded into the same dull, wet gray. At some point, I realized I couldn't just leave him sprawled on the bed with his throat torn open. Humans would come. They'd ask questions. I'd have to talk, and I didn't trust my voice not to drown us all. I slid out from under him carefully. The boat rocked. His body rolled with it, limp and yielding in ways living bodies never are. That post-mortem squish has never bothered me before. I've carried corpses across tilting decks my whole life. This time my stomach twisted. "Sorry," I muttered as his head bumped the bulkhead. Saw the... I picked him up. He'd always teased me about how strong I was, chalking it up to boat work. I'd laughed and let him think that. Now I used that strength to carry him to the tiny bathroom. The bathtub was a joke, more like a deep sink, but it was the only place on the boat that felt remotely like a coffin. I laid him in it, turning his face away from the mirror. The skin around the wound at his throat was already drying tacky, dark. I turned on the faucet. Water splashed over his chest, diluted the blood, turned it rosier. It swirled away, gurgling down the drain to mix with the harbor. I washed him the way I'd washed unconscious survivors, methodical and gentle. I wiped the blood off his lips, cleaned under his nails, smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Come on," I whispered, half insane. "Do the thing." The stupid, relaxed face. The one you make when you fall asleep on me. Dead muscles don't cooperate. His features refused to soften the way they had when he'd nuzzled his face into my shoulder. No matter how I pressed and smoothed, he looked wrong, like a doll someone had posed badly. When he was clean, I carried him back to the bed and dressed him in his favorite hoodie and the soft, threadbare sweatpants he'd worn on every shore leave. I pulled the blanket up under his chin. He looked like he was about to ask for coffee. If I hadn't known every centimeter of him, I might have believed it. I sat there for a long time. Minutes. Hours. The boat creaked. Ropes strained against cleats. Water lapped at the hull. Somewhere in the marina, a halyard clanged against a mast, steady and rhythmic, like a cheap imitation of a heartbeat. Walking away from bodies has never been hard for me. Men choke, lungs fill, lights go out, I leave. That's the rhythm of what I am. Take, move, forget. I've stepped off sinking ships without a backward glance. I didn't move until dawn. The sky turned from black to purple to a flat, washed-out gray. Sea fog pressed against the portholes, turning the world outside into a smear. When I finally stood, my joints ached like I'd aged a decade in one night. I walked into the engine room and did something I've never done before. I stuck around for the aftermath. If you open the wrong valves in an old boat and give a neglected engine a little encouragement, you can make a very convincing disaster. Humans always want something to blame that isn't themselves. I loosened fittings. I cracked fuel lines. I pulled 2 fire extinguishers off their mounts and set them neatly on the floor like I tried to use them and failed. Then I went back to the cabin and scattered some of my own clothes around like I'd run, panicked. The last thing I did before I left was stand in the doorway and look at him one more time. He still didn't look peaceful, but he looked contained, wrapped in our blanket, in our bed, on our floating pile of memories. It was the best I could do. "Sorry," I told him. My voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "You deserved better." I walked off the boat, up the slick wooden ramp to the dock. The air was knife cold. Fog beaded on my lashes. I found a shadowed spot between 2 stacks of crab pots and watched. When the engine finally coughed and the fumes hit something that didn't like them, the fire started fast. It licked out of the vents, orange and hungry, took a deep breath of oxygen, and roared. Somebody on a neighboring boat yelled. Sirens wailed onshore a minute later. The marina lit up with flashing lights and chaotic human activity. Firefighters unspooled hoses. The spray hissed when it hit the flames, steam billowing. The boat's paint blistered and peeled. Glass cracked. The hull, already tired of being held together, gave up with a long, tortured groan. I'd fed on men in burning ships before and never stuck around to see how their things burned. I never watched fires swallow photo frames, favorite mugs, stained mattresses. I'd never watched a home become a steaming pile of scrap and ash. When part of the deck caved in and the cabin roof collapsed, I told myself that was when his body fell through and sank, that he slipped quietly into the harbor he loved, wrapped in wood and tarp and our blanket, that the cold, dark water closed over him and tucked him in. It comforted me more than it should have. I stood there until the flames were out and the boat was just a soaked, smoking carcass half submerged at the slip, until the firefighters left, muttering about wiring and negligence, until the harbor quieted again and all that was left was the sound of water slapping charred-wood. I'd swallowed countless men and boys who never had anyone cry over them. I had never, until that moment, felt the need to say goodbye to any of them. I turned away from the wreck, the fog swallowing it behind me, and walked along the dock with the hollow certainty that I had absolutely ruined something I didn't understand. I didn't try to feed again for a long time. Long means something different to me than it does to you. Days blur into tides. Months go by like passing squalls. I anchored myself in shallow routines and empty harbors and tried to pretend the gnawing in my gut was just grief, not hunger. I slept in abandoned shacks near the docks, half-sunk barges, under piers where barnacles crept up the pylons and waves chewed the beams black. I took temp jobs where I didn't have to talk much. Night watch on empty marinas, safety checks on half-shuttered rigs, freelance medic on ships no one would ask too many questions about. The smell of other people's blood started to make me queasy. I'd clean injuries with my jaw clenched, breathing through my mouth, pretending the metallic tang didn't make me want to gag. They thought I was just another medic who'd seen too much. The thing is, no matter how strong you are, you can't starve forever. Not when your entire existence is built around taking. The emptiness didn't stay just an emotion. It became physical. At first, it was just this constant hollow ache under my ribs. Then it spread, turning my limbs heavy, my thoughts slow. Colors drained from the world again, even the ones that had started to creep back after the fire. I tried to fake it, bought coffee I couldn't taste, ate greasy dock food that sat in my stomach like stones, forced myself to work out on deck with the crew so they'd stop asking if I was okay. Every night, when the boat or the rig or whatever metal box I was stuck on creaked and groaned in the swell, when water slapped against steel in that slow, heart-like rhythm, I'd lie there and wait to feel him. Some hint of him, some echo of his warmth. Nothing. Silence under the knocks. It wasn't until the hunger got so bad that the sound of someone laughing made my jaw hurt that the sea started talking again. It was Valentine's Day. The humans were into their usual seasonal madness. Cheap roses, heart-shaped balloons whipping in the wind, couples crowding into waterfront restaurants. The town I was holed up in that winter had this long, curved seawall with a narrow strip of black sand on one side and a line of tacky bars on the other. The waves were small that night, the water a flat sheet of ink. I'd been drifting along the top of the seawall for an hour, watching the red and pink reflections smear over the water like blood thinned with too much saline. The hunger was starting to override the emptiness. My mouth kept filling with saliva whenever someone laughed too loud, whenever someone brushed against someone else, and that brief flare of shared warmth lit up between them. I told myself I could wait, that I'd find someone who didn't matter, someone whose blood would taste like old pennies and resentment and wouldn't make me feel anything. Then I saw them, down on the sand, right at the waterline where the waves rolled up and sighed away. A couple stood facing each other. He was in a cheap suit with pants too long, cuffs already damp with seawater. She wore a summer dress and a cardigan even though the air was freezing. Her bare feet were half buried in wet sand. He was talking too fast, hands shaking. She was laughing, wiping at her eyes like she couldn't believe he'd gone this far. A tiny circle of humans had formed up the beach, pretending not to watch while blatantly watching. I realized it was a proposal when he dropped to one knee and the people on the wall sucked in a collective breath. The lights from the bar behind me glittered on the tiny ring in his hand. I should have felt disgust, sarcasm, something like that. Instead, all I felt was raw, sharp hunger. From where I stood, I could smell everything about them. How his sweat stank of cheap cologne and someone else's perfume. How her heartbeat thudded crazily against the thin wall of her chest. The way her warmth flared brighter when she saw the ring, then cooled just slightly when a hand she placed over her stomach shifted and she winced. She was pregnant, newly. The blood in her smelled faintly different, thicker, carrying 2 heartbeats. He reeked of another woman's soap, clinging to his neck and the cuff of his shirt just above the wrist where a smear of lipstick hadn't quite washed off. His warmth was sharp and thin, all spikes and angles, feeding on her glow with every word he said. This wasn't the kind of happiness Eric carried. This was one of those short-lived flashes humans chase and bleed for. A lie you tell with a ring and a promise you never plan to keep. If I take her, I thought, half delirious, I could make it quick. I could hold her while she goes. She'd never know what he was. She'd never have to feel him drain her dry. The idea tasted kind. That was the sick part. I twisted something monstrous into the shape of mercy just to give myself an excuse. I stepped off the seawall. The drop to the sand was about 15 feet. I landed light, knees bending, toes sinking into the cold grit. The water rushed up to kiss my ankles, then slid away with a shushing sound. Like it didn't want to draw attention. No one looked at me. They were all focused on the couple, on the little drama playing out at the edge of the tide. He was waiting, ring held up, eyes wide, smile stretched. She had both hands over her mouth, shoulders shaking. Yes, she sobbed. Yes, of course. Everyone on the wall cheered. Someone whistled. A wave rolled in and soaked his shins. He laughed, grabbed her by the waist, spun her around. The ring flashed once in the light before he slid it onto her finger. I walked toward them, one step too. The water kept rushing in around my feet and retreating, pulling at me like it wanted me back where I belonged. I felt him before I felt his arms. It started as a warmth at my back, like someone had opened a door behind me and a blast of heated engine room air had hit my spine. For a second, I thought it was just the crowd's noise, the combined warmth of all those humans. Then it wrapped around me. Arms, but not arms. Pressure, but not physical. A firm, encompassing hold that slipped between me and the wind, between me and the hunger, between me and the world. There was no weight. Nothing touched my skin, but I felt hands slide around my waist, a chest press against my back, a head tuck into the curve of my neck. I froze mid-step. My toe dug deeper into the wet sand, water swirling around my ankle like it was trying to clean a wound. It was him. I knew it in the marrow I opened whenever I fed. Eric had a particular way of holding me when he thought I was asleep. He'd scoop me in like a kid scared of being pushed away and then forget to let go, fingers twitching whenever he dreamed about water. The pressure now was exactly that. Firm enough to keep me pinned. Gentle enough that I could pull away if I wanted. I didn't want. The humans on the beach blurred. The sound of the surf faded under the roar of my pulse. All that existed for a timeless second was that impossible embrace. His warmth seeped into the hollow I'd been carrying around, filling the shape of it without quite touching the edges. It hurt. It soothed. It was wrong. It was perfect. You can move, some rational part of me said. You're not actually being held. Walk. Feed. You need this. I tested it. Shifted my weight forward half an inch. The warmth moved with me, tight, like he was holding on harder, like if I took another step I'd slip right out of his arms and lose him again. The couple's laughter, the cheering, the waves, the clink of glasses from a bar, the distant thump of bad music, all of it swirled around me like sound underwater, muffled and far away. He didn't speak. There was no whisper in my ear, no ghostly don't or stop. Just warmth and this steady, unshakable refusal to let go. The couple turned, still wrapped around each other, and started back up the beach past me. She brushed my shoulder, just barely. The warmth she radiated flickered against my skin like a candle. The stale, hungry pull of him tugged at it from the other side. I could have reached out and touched her pulse. It was right there, humming along, ignorant of cliffs and sharks and men like him. I stayed still. They passed. The crowd followed. No one looked at me, standing knee-deep in a tiny wave that refused to recede, foam bubbling around my legs like it was trying to hold me in place too. Time got strange. The moon slid across the sky. The tide shifted, water creeping higher up my thighs, then receding again. People came and went, coats pulled tight, hands jammed in pockets. Couples argued in low, intense voices. Kids ran along the sand, shrieking, chasing each other with glow sticks. The air got colder, then less cold. The color of the water changed, black to slate to bruised blue. I didn't shiver. I didn't move. The arms of nothing held me, and I let myself stay there. Hours bled into something larger. At some point, I realized the emptiness had receded. Not filled, not fixed, just less. The hunger had backed off too, sulking in some corner of me that couldn't compete with what was happening. When the warmth finally faded, it didn't just blink out. It thinned slowly, like fog burning off under a weak sun. The pressure around my ribs lightened. The impression of fingers at my waist eased. He didn't pull away in some dramatic swoop. He just let go. In the gentlest way you can let go of someone you have no business holding anymore. My knees trembled. The wave I'd been standing in slid back, tugging on the sand under my feet. I staggered once, caught myself, and stood alone in the chilly February dawn. I took a breath. The air tasted like salt and exhaust and sugar from spilled cocktails. For the first time in months, it didn't hurt to inhale. I wasn't hungry. Cold, yes. Bone-deep cold. But I could look at the people trudging along the seawall and not see them as walking blood bags. Their colors were still muted, but here and there I saw little sparks. Someone laughing at a stupid joke, a kid pointing at a gull, a man bending to tie his partner's boot. They glowed. Little points of warmth in a gray world I wasn't desperate to devour anymore. I wish I could say I figured it all out right then. That I turned around on the beach, raised my arms, and shouted, "He's still here," or some dramatic shit like that. I didn't. I climbed back up the seawall, walked along the path until the town thinned out and a small park came into view, tucked between the road and a tidal lagoon. It had a crappy playground, a line of battered picnic tables, and a view of the water that would have been pretty if the sky wasn't the same color as dishwater. I sat on a bench and watched the kids. It's a weird thing to admit, given what I am, but I like watching children near water. Not in a creepy way. I like how fearless they're before adults teach them to be afraid. How they run straight at the waves and let them knock them over, then come up sputtering and laughing. How they throw rocks into tide pools and squeal when something moves. That day, the lagoon was at mid-tide. Enough water to reflect the sky, not enough to cover the patches of eelgrass. A group of kids in bright jackets were playing some kind of improvised game on the narrow shore where the mud met the gravel. Behind them, parents and grandparents clustered around the picnic tables, drinking coffee, shouting the occasional warning. From where I sat, the kids weren't just shapes or sounds. They were sparks. I don't know how else to describe it. My eyes were working differently. Every time a kid shrieked with laughter, a little flare of color popped in my vision. When one of them climbed up the chain-link fence and a parent snapped, the color dimmed but didn't go out. When a toddler tripped and another kid reached down to help, the warmth around them brightened like someone had turned up a dimmer switch. They weren't just future food. They were little bonfires, each one carrying a unique pattern of heat. For the first time in a very long existence, my first instinct wasn't that would taste good. It was, I want that to keep burning. A group of them had a birthday thing going on. Balloons tied to one of the picnic tables, a cake shaped like a whale, paper plates scattered in the wet grass. One boy, freckled and gap-toothed, was opening presents under a towel some adult had rigged into a makeshift tent to keep off the drizzle. Core memories, as humans like to call them, were forming right in front of me. The taste of salt on frosting, the feel of cold mud between toes, the sound of gulls screaming overhead while someone sings off-key. Little anchors that might, if the kid was lucky, keep him tethered to something warm when life got colder later. They glowed, so bright it almost hurt my eyes. Then something else glowed. It was small at first, a speck, like a single grain of bioluminescent plankton drifting in dark water. It moved differently than the others, not tied to any one kid or adult. It flickered above the group, then drifted away, carried on some current I couldn't feel. It floated over their heads, across the damp grass, and toward me. I didn't move, partly out of surprise, partly because some instinct deeper than hunger told me not to spook it. The speck of warmth hovered in front of my face for a moment, trembling. I could feel it on my skin, like the faintest kiss of warm air from an open oven a room away. Then it dropped, slow and deliberate, and landed in my palm. My fingers closed around it automatically. It tingled. Not like electricity, not exactly. More like the feeling you get when you've been holding onto a cold metal rail and then suddenly let go. The blood rushes back in, pins and needles. Only this time it was inside my chest, not my hand. There were no words, no voice, just an impression. Stand up. I did, knees creaking slightly, which was more habit than necessity. Turn around. I turned. The lagoon, the road, the cars in the distance, all of it blurred at the edges. The little speck of warmth pulsed against my skin, a gentle tug. Go! It pulled me along the edge of the park, past the swings, past the grimy public restrooms that smelled like piss and bleach and damp concrete, around the back of a low building used for the sailing club. The smell of wet ropes and mildew hit me. Somewhere behind it, I heard the clank of metal against metal and the creak of something rocking. As I rounded the corner, I saw him. If you wanted to build the most forgettable man alive, you'd make him look like this. Medium height, soft around the middle, thinning hair plastered to his scalp with rain. Clothes in non-committal shades of brown and gray. He was the human equivalent of a wet dishcloth. But his eyes were a fucking void. Most people carry some kind of warmth in their gaze. Even assholes, even abusers. It might be warped and twisted, pointed inward, constantly hungry, but it's there. This guy's eyes were just empty, not the same as my emptiness. Mine was a wound. His was an absence, a pit. He was holding a little girl by the wrist. She couldn't have been more than 7. Pink raincoat, boots with cartoon fish on them, a braid that had come partly undone, so strands stuck to her wet cheeks. Tears had carved tracks through the dirt on her face. Come on, he was saying, voice pitched in that fake cheerful tone adults use when they want a kid to stop crying so they don't have to deal with it. We're gonna get your mom. She's just over there by the marina. Remember? You said you lost her? I saw her go this way. The girl sniffled. I want to go back, she hiccuped. I want to find my mom. I couldn't see a speck of warmth on him, not a flicker. What he did have clutched in his free hand, so tight his knuckles were white, was a tiny wad of stolen glow. I could see it the way you'd see phosphorescence on water after a boat passes. It was her warmth, the part of her that trusted adults, the part that wanted comfort. He was squeezing the shit out of it. He still had the loose, satisfied grin of someone whose plan was working perfectly, of someone who'd done this kind of thing before and never been caught. In his head, I could tell the next 20 minutes were already mapped out. Get to the parking lot, the van, the road, the quiet place. The little spark in my hand pulsed so hard it hurt. Now, I didn't realize I'd moved until I was right behind him. I grabbed his wrist, the one holding the girl, with a grip that would have been way too strong for any normal woman my size. Bones ground together under my fingers. He yelped and spun, trying to yank away. The girl stumbled and fell on the wet concrete, hands going out to catch herself. Her palm slapped into a puddle, cold water splashing up her sleeve. What the? He started. then shut his mouth when he saw my face. I smiled. It felt wrong on my skin. "Hey," I said lightly. "You lost." He tried to pull the normal guy act, the Good Samaritan tone. No, we're fine," he said. "I'm just helping my niece here find her mom." She got turned around at the park. The word niece was the wrong shape in his mouth. It tasted false. I squeezed his wrist harder. I heard the tiny crunch before I felt it. His eyes went wide. The girl cried out, sucked in a breath to scream. I glanced at her and softened my voice. "It's okay," I told her. "He's not your uncle. I'm going to take him to the doctor now, okay? He hurt his arm. Can you go back to the birthday party and tell your mom you're safe?" She looked between us, lower lip trembling. Kids aren't stupid. They feel things adults pretend aren't there. Whatever she saw in his face finally registered. "Okay," she whispered. She scrambled to her feet and bolted. I watched her run all the way to the cluster of adults, where she latched onto one woman with hair the same color as hers and buried her face in her coat. The woman's warmth flared when she wrapped her arms around her kid. The spark of my hand dimmed. Job done. Toe man, because that's what he reminded me of, some swollen, infected toe shoved into a boot that didn't fit. Try to jerk away again. "You're crazy," he hissed. "Let go or I'll call the cops." "With what?" I asked. I tightened my grip. His wrist did something wet and soft inside his skin. His knees buckled. He started screaming then. Loud. High. Ugly. It echoed off the concrete wall and rolled out over the lagoon, startling a raft of sleeping ducks. "Shut up," I said mildly. I dragged him backward, away from the park, toward the little service road that led down to the marina parking lot. His shoes squeaked on the wet pavement. He tried to dig his heels in. It did nothing. Most monsters hide. I made a living out of shadows and storms. That day, in broad daylight, with humans 30 meters away, I didn't care. There's something about hunger mixed with rage, mixed with that new warmth inside me that makes caution feel like an optional extra. We reached the parking lot. His van was exactly what you're picturing. Ugly, white, panel sides with no windows. Back doors already cracked, open an inch. The smell of old sweat and something else sour seeped out. "Of course," I muttered. "A fucking course." He stopped screaming and started bargaining. Hey, look, you don't know what you're doing," he babbled. She said she was lost. "I was helping, that's all. Please, we could talk about this. I have a job, I slammed him against the side of the van. The metal boomed, the sound rolling across the parking lot and bouncing back from the water. "Do you know," I said conversationally, "how many men I've watched pulled out of the sea because of guys like you? How many divers, coasties, fishermen? Men who went back in when they didn't have to because some kid was missing or some woman screamed from a dark car." He blinked, panting, sweat beading on his upper lip. I don't. "Of course you don't," I said. "You don't think about anything that isn't you." I let go of his wrist long enough to rip open the back doors. Inside, there was a mattress, a roll of duct tape, a plastic bin shoved against one wall that I didn't let myself look inside, a small cooler, rope, stains. The smell of stale fear hung in the air, thick and cloying. I could have killed him. I wanted to. My teeth ached. My gut clenched. His blood would have been sour and thin and probably not enough to do more than take the edge off, but it would have shut him up forever. I could imagine it so clearly, his throat under my tongue, his heartbeat stuttering, his warmth flickering out into the gray. The spark of my hand pulsed once. Not a command, a reminder. Killing him wouldn't make me warm, and it wouldn't undo anything he'd already done. I grabbed the steering wheel column and yanked. Metal snapped with a gratifying crunch. The wheel jerked sideways, hung limp. Plastic and wires tore free. I tore them all out, handfuls of tangled guts, and tossed them onto the wet asphalt. He made a noise, strangled and disbelieving. What are you?" He'd meant it rhetorically. I could hear the panic behind the words. But some cruel, tired part of me wanted to answer. "Hungry," I said, "but not for you." I shoved him into the back of the van. He tripped over the mattress and went down hard. I slammed the door shut, hard enough to rattle the whole vehicle. The locking mechanism clicked. I bent the metal around it with my fingers until it wouldn't open from the inside again without tools. Maybe he'd bash his way out with something. Maybe someone would hear him and call the police. Maybe he'd sit in there for hours, wrists screaming, surrounded by the stink of what he'd planned, and maybe there would be enough to make him think twice next time. Or maybe not. Predators like him don't stop because they get scared once. They stop when something bigger than them decides it's done. I walked away before I did something I'd enjoy too much. By the time I got back to the park, the birthday party was packing up. Parents were bundling kids into cars, wrestling them into dry clothes, wiping mud off their faces. The little girl I diverted was gripping her mother's hand so tight her knuckles were white. Every few seconds, she glanced around, checking, like she expected the man to appear from behind a tree. He didn't. I sat back on my bench. The spark in my hand softened, seeped into my skin, and settled somewhere behind my ribs. It felt like someone had put a hand on my shoulder from inside. That night, when I finally found somewhere to curl up, an unused maintenance room in the basement of the Harbor Authority, smelling like damp mop heads and diesel, I dreamed. I don't really dream, not like humans do. When I sink into deep places, my mind empties like a ballast tank flooding. I sleep in blankness. This time, there was weight. It pressed against my back, warm and solid. An arm slid under my head. Another wrapped around my waist. A leg hooked over mine. The old, familiar tangle of shared sleep. I knew, in that dumb, hopeful way that hurts, that if I turned around, there'd be nothing there. No body, no face, no soft blue eyes. I didn't turn. Sometimes, not looking is the only thing that keeps a fragile thing from shattering. I lay there in that not place, letting the warmth seep into me, and for the first time since the night I killed him, I slept. Really slept. When I woke, the room was still dark. The hum of the building, the distant slap of water against pilings, the creaks of settling pipes. Everything sounded sharper and clearer. My body felt lighter. Not full, not the hot, humming fullness feeding usually gave me, but not hollow either. If you've ever been half frozen and then someone puts a mug of something hot in your hands, that's what it felt like. A small, contained warmth I could wrap my fingers around. I couldn't feel in the way I had on the beach. No arms, no chest against my back, just that lingering sense of being held, faint but unmistakable. I did something then that I hadn't done since I was human. I said his name out loud when I was alone. Eric, I whispered, voice catching halfway between a laugh and a sob. The room didn't change. No dramatic gust of wind rattled the pipes. No voice echoed back, but that small warmth flared just for a second. We didn't figure out all at once. There was no instruction manual for what happens when a man you love dies in your arms and his warmth refuses to leave, especially when you're the kind of creature that's supposed to digest that warmth and move on. It took time, a lot of empty nights and small, sharp moments where I almost slipped back into old habits. I started seeing sparks everywhere after that day at the park, on a ferry crossing a choppy channel in early spring. When the captain decided to turn back rather than plow through a storm to stay on schedule, tiny specks of golden light drifted up from relieved passengers and hovered around his shoulders. I watched his jaw clench as angry commuters shouted at him, and I saw his warmth flare anyway when a kid hugged his leg and said, "Thank you for keeping us safe." In a harbor dive shop, when a grizzled instructor refused to take a group of drunk tourists on a night dive they'd paid double for, insisting the conditions weren't safe, his blood simmered with annoyance and fear. But his warmth stayed steady, a low, solid glow. The tourists' heat barely flickered, all blown fuses and cheap thrills. On a stormy night, hunched under the cover of a pier while rain hammered the water flat, I watched two rescue swimmers on the far side of the harbor gear up to jump from a helicopter into the black. They weren't excited. They were resigned. Their warmth was sharp, steel-hot. The mother on the dock behind the barricade screaming for them to hurry blazed like a bonfire. Every time I felt the old hunger rise, when a vein pulsed a little too close, when an argument surged into violence and blood scented the air, when someone brushed past me dripping with unguarded warmth, something inside nudged me. Not a voice, a feeling, a pressure, a quiet firm, not this one. Once, in the galley of a Coast Guard cutter I'd hired onto as a medic, a young sailor cut his hand on a can opener. The smell hit me like a punch. Nice kid, big laugh, always offering to take extra watches so the guys with families could sleep. I stepped in to help, fingers already itching. He held his hand out, wincing, blood welling bright and tempting over his knuckles. I leaned in, opened my mouth to say something reassuring, and for a split second, I saw his warmth the way I saw Eric's. This soft, selfless glow wrapped in ugly tattoos and bad jokes. The same pattern, different instrument. My teeth tingled. Then there was a sound. 3 knocks. Not on the hull. Not from the water outside. From inside me. 3 sharp, hollow taps against my ribs. My hand jerked. The scalpel I'd picked up clattered back into the tray. "You okay?" the kid asked, blinking. "Gloves," I said too loud. I forgot gloves. The knocks faded. The hunger receded, embarrassingly fast. I patched him up with shaking hands, pretending the tremor was from the ship's movement. After that, I started paying attention. Every time I reached for someone with that old, greedy intent, something intervened. Sometimes it was a weight on my shoulders, like someone was pulling me back from a railing. Sometimes it was those 3 knocks echoing through my bones. Sometimes it was a small, drifting spark landing in my palm and pulling me somewhere else. Away from a bar fight, toward an alley where a drunk girl had passed out with her feet in the rising tide. Away from a dark stairwell, toward the sound of someone coughing in a flooded basement. I didn't always listen. I'm not going to pretend I turned into some saint overnight. There were nights when the emptiness overwhelmed the warmth. When I closed my hand around someone's glow and bit down anyway. The blood tasted wrong every time I ignored him. Flat, thin, like drinking lukewarm seawater and expecting it to soothe your thirst. The more I tried to chase that old, mindless satisfaction, the more violently my body rejected it. I'd end up crouched over some storm drain or bilge grate, vomiting into the dark, shuddering with the knowledge that I'd wasted a life and gotten nothing in return. But when I listened, when I followed the nudges instead of fighting them, I started to understand. There's something no one tells you about being a predator for as long as I've been one. You get bored. The patterns repeat. The faces change. The roles stay the same. Hero, coward, martyr, traitor, dinner, background noise. Eric was new, not because he was the first warm human I'd met, not even because I loved him in any way you'd recognize. He was new because he didn't think his warmth was special. He just gave it away without tallying the cost. He died the way he lived, giving without realizing how rare that made him. Was blood hit mine, it should have been just another meal. His warmth should have suffused me, burned bright for a few days, then dimmed as I used it up. It didn't. Instead, it stayed, stubborn, refused to dissolve. Humans like to talk about evolution like it's a ladder, as if there's some higher form waiting at the top. It's not like that. It's more like currents and trenches and weird side branches of fish that decide to crawl onto land or glow in the dark. Somewhere along the line, after centuries of being prey, after generations of men and women throwing themselves at storms and sinking ships and monsters in the dark water, one of them figured out how to hitch a ride back. It didn't make me burst into flames. It didn't make me fall apart. It just changed the rules. I was working a contract on an offshore platform the first time I admitted it to myself. It was one of those massive rigs that look like whole cities perched on an iron skeleton, lights blazing against an endless night sea. The kind of place that hums constantly. Engines throbbing, cranes whining, pumps chugging. The smell of crude oil and salt and welding fumes permeated everything. I'd taken the onboard medic slot again. They always need one. Men get hurt when you cram that many of them onto a floating metal spider in the middle of nowhere. Night shift. The wind was up, waves slapping hard against the pylons. The whole structure creaked and shuddered like a thing trying to tear itself free of its anchors. I was in the infirmary, restocking meds when the alarm went off. 3 short blasts over the PA, the kind that make everyone's gut go cold. Man overboard, south leg. Man overboard, south leg. The speaker crackled. All available personnel to muster. Man overboard. The words jolted something in me. Old memories of bodies falling, of hands missing rails, of eyes going wide as gravity and water conspired. I grabbed a radio and ran. The south leg was a maze of catwalks and ladders and graded platforms slick with spray. Men in orange coveralls clustered against the rail, peering down into the blackness below. Floodlights cut cones of harsh white into the waves, making them look like snapped bones. "Who is it?" I shouted over the wind. "Reyes," someone yelled back. Rope snapped while he was checking the struts. He went under the flare. The flares hissed and spat, dumping fire into the night. The water around the rig boiled with light and heat, shadows leaping. Somewhere down there, a man in a harness and flotation suit was being tossed like a toy. I pushed through the knot of bodies, grabbed a pair of binoculars from a stunned supervisor, and scanned. There, a flash of orange in the chaos. An arm flailing, a head going under, coming up, mouth open in a shout that got swallowed by the wind. Beside me, the platform's rescue swimmer, big guy, thick shoulders, steady eyes, was already shrugging into gear. He caught my eye. "You any good with ropes, Doc?" he shouted. "I'm better in the water," I shot back. His eyebrows rose. "You dive?" "Yeah." It wasn't a lie. It just didn't convey the full truth. He hesitated for half a second, then tossed me a harness. "You're on safety then. If his line fouls, you cut me loose." The words hit something very old in me. If the line fouls, cut it. It's one of those quiet rules that keeps divers alive, or at least gives them a better chance at not killing their whole crew when things go wrong. I clipped in. My fingers moved automatically, muscle memory from 100 shipboard drills. The wind howled through the gaps in the structure, flinging salty spray into my face. Somewhere below, Reyes shouted again, voice cracking on the end. We lowered the rescue swimmer. He swung out from the rig, a small, bright figure against the raging black, and plunged into the illuminated patch of water. The rope thrummed in my hands. The tension sang through steel and flesh. I felt something else then, layered under the immediate adrenaline. A presence at my back. No arms this time. No obvious ghost limbras. Just a warmth at my shoulder, like someone standing close behind me, radiating steady heat. "Hold," that feeling said without words. "Wait, watch." I watched. The swimmer reached Reyes, wrapped an arm around his chest, signaled up. The winch screamed. The rope vibrated harder. Something down there snagged, debris, current, some invisible snag in the scaffolding. The line juddered. The winch stalled. The supervisor swore. Shit, he muttered. "It's fouled. If it snaps." He looked at me. The knife on my belt suddenly felt very heavy. Old training manuals flickered through my head. Protocols, flow charts, diagrams of how quickly hypothermia sets in at different water temperatures. I could feel the strain in the rope like a heartbeat. I could feel the two bodies at the other end, one thrashing, one steady. "Cut me loose," the swimmer had said. Not cut him loose. Cut me. I could taste his warmth. Solid, tempered, willing to drown to save a co-worker he'd maybe bitched about 10 minutes ago in the break room. The hunger stirred. "You could save one," some feral part of me whispered. "Cut the wrong line, and you get two instead." So much heat all at once. You could glut yourself and sleep through a century. 3 knocks. This time, not against my ribs, against the knife itself, ringing through metal into bone. I flinched. "Hold," that quiet presence insisted. "Not this way." I waited. The winch jolted, groaned, then caught. The rope started moving again, centimeter by painful centimeter. Men shouted, hands hauling in slack, bodies braced against steel. Reyes' head broke the surface first, gasping and spitting. The rescue swimmer came up right behind him, face grim, grip unshakable. They were both shivering so hard their teeth rattled, but they were alive. The men around me cheered. Someone clapped my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble. The supervisor turned to grin at me, sweat and spray mixing on his face. "Good call, Doc," he shouted. "Another second, and I would have had you cutting that line." I forced a smile I didn't feel. Later, in the infirmary, after Reyes had stopped shaking enough to hold the cup of hot chocolate I stuck in his hands, I shut myself in the little head and leaned against the sink. "You did that," I whispered to the stale air. "Didn't you?" No answer, of course, but the warmth in my chest pulsed once, gentle and sure. We figured it out slowly. He didn't like it when I fed on people who didn't deserve it. He didn't like it when I wasted warmth. He nudged. He knocked. He redirected. When I listened, I could feel him clearer. When I ignored him, he went quiet. The emptiness came roaring back, like a tide rushing in to fill a suddenly abandoned harbor. I started choosing. Not victims. Not like before. I started choosing where to aim the thing I am. Hunger is hunger. You can't make it noble by slapping a different label on it. But you can decide who pays the bill. There are people who walk along docks at night, looking for a body to push. Men who see drunk girls on the quays and think easy. Owners who send crews out in boats with known faults because the catch is worth more than their lives. Captains who skip maintenance because downtime costs money. I can taste them now. The wrongness in their blood sits on my tongue like oil. When the hunger gets bad, when the emptiness starts to chew on my insides, I go to the places they congregate. Cheap harbor bars, lonely stretches of seawall, the dark edges of marina parking lots where vans idle too long. Sometimes I just scare them, drag them somewhere wet and cold, and make them really look at how small they are against the water. Sometimes I break something they rely on, a wrist, an engine, a sense of invincibility. Sometimes I do worse. Every time, before I act, I feel for that warmth inside me. Sometimes it swells, approving. Sometimes it goes still, disapproving. We argue in our way, me with impulses and teeth, him with absence and withheld warmth. He wins more than I do. You could believe that or not. Doesn't change what happens on the nights when the tide is high and the wind carries the echo of 3 soft knocks through steel and bone. These days, when I stand on the deck of some ship in the dark and stare down into the black water, I don't just see my reflection. I see something else lurking back. Something older than me, shaped by storms and loss and stupid, stubborn human kindness. There's an image humans paint a lot, an angel wrestling a monster. Wings and horns, light and teeth, some dramatic struggle pose for maximum symbolic impact. The reality is Messier. There's no winged idiot grappling with me on a cliff. There's just a quiet, persistent human warmth lodged in the gut of a creature that should have digested him and moved on. I'm not redeemed. I'm not cleansed. I still slip. I still do things at 3 in the morning on the edge of breakwaters that would make you sleep with your lights on for the rest of your life. But every time I hold back when I wouldn't have before, every time I choose to let a piece of warmth walk away intact instead of swallowing it, I feel him. In the brush of unseen fingers at the small of my back when I lean too far over a rail. In the 3 knocks against a hull when we're anchored in calm water and some idiot is about to ignore a safety procedure. In the way my chest tightens when a kid runs too close to the edge of a dock, and I find myself there before anyone else, hand on their collar, pulling them back. I used to think my kind were the apex predators of this planet's wet places, that the ocean and I had an understanding. I took what I wanted, it took the rest. Then some regular, unremarkable guy with soft, blue eyes and a habit of tapping his knuckles on metal, ended up lodged beneath my sternum, refusing to either dissolve or leave. Humans evolved in fear of the dark and the deep. They huddled around fires, told stories about monsters in the water, learned the sound of keels grinding on shoals and storms flattening ships. They died by the thousands, swallowed by waves and teeth and fate. Somewhere along the way, all that dying and loving and throwing themselves into god-awful situations to save each other taught one of them how to do the unthinkable. He learned how to kill a thing like me without actually killing it. He didn't stake me or drag me into the sun or lure me into a net. He did something gentler and infinitely more violent. He climbed into my hunger and refused to be digested. So now, when I stand alone on some swaying deck at 3 a.m., to see a bottomless black plain around me, and I feel that old, familiar craving rise at the sound of a distant heartbeat, I wait. I listen. Sometimes the only answer is the wind whispering through rusted chains and the soft, relentless slap of water against steel. Sometimes there's nothing to stop me and nothing to save whoever's unlucky enough to be in front of me. But sometimes, more often than you'd expect in a world this cold, I feel a warmth at my back, see a tiny spark drift down into my palm, or hear 3 faint knocks echo through my ribs. When that happens, I smile into the dark, bare my teeth at the black water, and honor the stubborn human lodged in my chest the only way I know how. I become, just for a moment, the person he thought he saw when he was looking at me under that stupid ferry starboard window, the sunset reflected in his eyes and the whole harbor humming around us. Thousands of years of drowning and feeding and dragging bodies into the deep finally taught one human how to turn a monster inside out. I just wish he didn't have to die to do it.